In the nearly 100 hours that I've spent with the game, Orcs Must Die 3 has never felt boring. Developed by Robot Entertainment, the series is a tower defense strategy game where you place different traps around a map to try and stop a horde of enemies from reaching your tower. The game differentiates itself, however, by giving you a character to actively control on the map. In this way, it requires you to participate in the defense of your tower yourself, utilizing a third-person action combat style similar to something like The Witcher 3, but a lot more basic. How you'll feel about this game is just as likely to be determined by your feelings on strategy games as it is with how comfortable you are with third-person action games. The game all but requires you to put both of these tools to use, and when going for perfect scores on the highest difficulty, it can be quite punishing if you are weak in either one of these areas. In my opinion, this makes Orcs Must Die the Dark Souls of tower defense games. I'm mostly joking, but Orcs Must Die 3 does expect a lot from you, the player, as the challenge of solving each map becomes increasingly difficult. This is one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much and why I consider it one of my favorite strategy games. The game is also playable with a friend. I was fortunate enough to be able to play the entire game this way, and I can say without hesitation that co-op is the best way to experience this game. Should you play Orcs Must Die 3? I think I can give many of you that answer by just showcasing the first several levels in the game. You'll start in a simple hallway with the simple default orcs coming from a single door. You're given a pair of traps, one for the floor and one for the wall. The floor traps send spikes upward as orcs walk over it, and the wall one shoots arrows as they pass by. The next level features two doors that enemies can come from, however they still eventually converge into a single hallway. So it presents the idea of placing traps along routes that are shared by multiple enemy lanes. The third stage introduces a new enemy type in the kobolds that are speedy and will bolt past players towards the rift as opposed to trying to fight. To counter this, players are given a new floor trap that slows enemies down as they walk over it. The fourth level brings enemy archers who will shoot at you from afar. Additionally, now not only are there two doors that enemies can come from, but there are now two routes that they can take to the rift, forcing players to either divide up their resources in order to place traps along both routes, or completely paint jobbing one with traps and handling the other themselves. The next level throws another new enemy type at players called an ogre, which is stronger and slower but can stun players if it hits them. It also introduces a new floor trap called a barricade that's purpose is to direct and control the route that enemies can take by blocking off paths. It's likely that as you've been watching this footage, you've begun thinking about the different combinations of ways to place these traps. For example, using barricades to force the orcs into walking through your tar traps, slowing them down, all while peppering them with arrows from the wall traps. It's also likely that for some people, this was all you needed to see and that you've made up your mind about this game. However, if you haven't, I'll continue to go into more detail on what specifically makes the game so great in my opinion. As I mentioned, you start out against basic enemies with only a spike and arrow wall trap, and eventually you'll have this.
That was a thing. Back and sword is burnished. He killed lots of orcs.
Full-on death machines. This is the game, thinking of creative and efficient methods of orc-estrating death and destruction on ever-increasingly difficult maps. Orcs Must Die 3 excels at what I consider the three holy tenets of a good strategy game: puzzle solving, player creativity, and what I'm going to call mastery. Briefly explaining this, in a good strategy game, each level should be a puzzle that players are tasked with solving. This challenge should then fuel player creativity in trying different possible setups, which should eventually lead to a strategy that works, with higher difficulties often requiring efficiency and optimization on top of just a sound strategy, hence mastery. This cycle is then repeated on the next level, with some sort of increased or new challenge. Orcs Must Die 3 is best at the puzzle-solving aspect of this trinity. There are 31 levels total if you include both the expanded, large-scale war scenarios, as well as the 2 DLC expansions, which I recommend and will explain why a bit later on in this video. Orcs Must Die 3 consistently builds towards new and increasingly challenging scenarios for players. New enemy types continue to get introduced, like the health regenerating trolls, gnolls who exclusively hunt down the player, and bomb-strapped cobalt sappers who beeline for your barricades, which they can destroy when they detonate. The maps continue to grow more complex, with more possible routes enemies can take, more doors they can come from, longer waves to repel, and the war scenarios I mentioned a minute ago, which often act as benchmarks with unique boss enemies. And this is all met with an ever-increasing arsenal of tools to use. The game's many traps, weapons, and artifacts allow players to experiment with different setups and combinations in order to figure out what works for them, and in this way encourages player creativity. There are over 30 different traps for players to utilize. They can be organized by where they are placed on the map, meaning the floor, wall, or ceiling, but also by their range, their damage, if they are constant damage or require a short cooldown period after activating. Some traps have unique damage types, such as fire or acid damage. On top of traps, there are 9 different trinkets that players can carry in their inventory that each offer different abilities. These range from immediately resetting all traps when the trinket is activated, to temporarily creating a storm cloud that will help with crowd control by electrocuting nearby enemies. There are melee, ranged, and magic-based weapons for players to choose from for the third-person active defense part of the game. This leads into the final part of this cycle, mastery, or simply put, some type of skill test. And I want to clarify that I don't just mean being able to beat a level, but rather performing and winning at the highest possible skill level that the game offers. This might come across as a bit pretentious or gatekeepery, but I sincerely don't mean it in that way. I don't think achieving this mastery should be required by players in order to enjoy or even play the game. This is personally one of the reasons many of the Dark Souls style of games largely don't appeal to me. However, I do firmly believe that a good strategy game needs to offer some sort of higher challenge level for players that want it. I would encourage new players to first play through the entirety of the game on the medium tier difficulty. That's what I did, and it gives you some degree of challenge while more importantly letting you focus on the puzzle that each level is and how best to tackle it. Don't focus on earning a perfect score on this difficulty and instead just try out different strategies, traps, and weapons. Then, once you have completed all of the levels and upgraded your favorite equipment, then move up to the highest difficulty called Rift Lord and go for perfect scores on every map. In order to do so, you can't allow a single enemy into your rift, and you have to complete the stage in a specific par time. On this difficulty, enemies also have more health, do more damage, and advanced enemies appear in earlier maps. All of these factors together cause Orcs Must Die 3 to play like a completely different game, forcing players to truly think about how to optimize for all of the factors in a level. I found this to be the best part of the game, and I feel confident saying that if you enjoy the process of fine-tuning and problem-solving, then you will feel the same. The 2 DLC expansions that are available for the game are worthwhile additions to your shopping cart as well. The first, titled Cold as Eyes, introduces several new ice-based Cyclops enemies, the best designed of these being one that can temporarily disable traps. The second expansion is titled Tipping the Scales, and again introduces a new race of enemies based on the Tuatara reptiles. The uniqueness of this enemy type comes from their damage cap, which limits how much damage they can receive from any one attack. Between the 2 of these expansions, there are 8 additional campaign maps added, as well as a trap, trinket, and weapon for each of them. These new enemy types, gear, and maps go a long way in adding further game content to play, and in particular, several of the new maps, in combination with the new enemy types, I found to be some of the hardest content offered by the game. Now, in addition to all of the campaign content, there are 2 other modes available to spend time with. The first is an endless mode, where select maps allow you to continue on wave after wave forever, or until you lose all of your rift points. enemies become more difficult and money becomes rarer in the higher rounds, which creates the challenge. It essentially is an expanded version of the campaign levels, and for that reason it's quite good. It tests your ability to think of long-term viable solutions, especially as money becomes tighter and tighter. The other game mode is called Scramble, which sees you doing a set of 5 different maps featuring one pool of rift points. The best part of this mode is the different buffs and debuffs that are applied to your run after each stage, because they have the potential to completely force strategy changes. For example, one debuff that I have gotten made enemies completely immune to all physical types of damage, rendering my selected weapons useless the following round. I'll circle back to this concept of adding buffs and debuffs later in this video. At this point in the video, I'm going to shift gears and talk briefly about the core problem that the game has, as well as make suggestions for future content and a few quality of life improvements. I want to clarify that none of the things I'm going to bring up even come close to ruining the game. They are intended more as an analysis of how the game could be made even better.
Just point me to the after party.
Orcs Must Die 3's biggest and really only problem is with balancing. Everything from the economy and cost of traps to the entire viability of different traps, weapons, and trinkets. Often certain traps such as the ceiling lasers, barricades, or the tar traps seemed all but required if you wanted a serious shot at beating a map, especially on the highest difficulty. Barricades in particular seem so foundational to almost any and every strategy that it feels cheap that I am essentially forced to always give up one of my inventory spots to take them. The ceiling lasers are another trap that seldom left my inventory because of just how much better they are than any other ceiling trap. It is the only trap in the game besides the floor-based Briar Patch that deals damage constantly with no cooldown period. It also has infinite range, which becomes relevant due to many of the stages featuring sections with high ceilings. The range, no cooldown, and solid damage output meant it almost always became the primary ceiling trap in use. Another example is with the flyer enemy types that get added into the game during the second campaign. There aren't many consistently good traps to use against flyers. I really only experienced 2, the Guardian Archers and the Auto Ballistas. However, neither of these felt reliable. You know what was reliable though? The Stone Staff weapon that's available. It allows you to temporarily turn enemies to stone, which when used against the flyers, sent them crashing to the ground for an instant kill. This worked 100% of the time, which once I discovered this, why would I spend my money on traps that were going to be less efficient at dealing with them? These are just a few examples of the types of issues that plague the trap economy in the game, which in turn impacts player creativity. Understanding the potential advantages of different traps also isn't as easy as it should be. In a game all about optimization and creating efficient killing machines, I find it absolutely baffling that there isn't a way to compare the stats of different traps, such as the actual damage numbers within the game. This information exists too because you can look it up on the Orcs Must Die wiki, but the point is that it should be in the game. It should be right here in one of these blank spaces on the gear upgrade screen. The only reason that I can think of why Robot Entertainment doesn't have this information in game is because they know it will expose how broken some of the traps are. Luckily, I think many of the balance issues can easily be fixed. For example, with the ceiling lasers, it either needs to have its cost increased or its damage lowered. Either one of these would help balance it among the other ceiling traps. Alternatively, or perhaps in addition to, they should prioritize the development of a new type of ceiling trap that could share similarities to the ceiling lasers, but with different benefits and drawbacks. Robot Entertainment has actually done something like this in the past with the tar trap. Through an update, they reduced its cost, but also created a new floor trap in the Briarwood, which also slows enemies, not to the same degree, but instead does small constant damage as enemies move through it. It is much more expensive, but can also grow and produce new patches of the trap on its own. This addition was great, and I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. In addition to balancing some of the gear, there are also a few quality of life improvements that Robot Entertainment should entertain the idea of fixing or adding. First is the par timer. It begins counting down the moment players hit the ready button, which at face value might make sense, but then you realize that you have to wait for the orc horde to break through the doors. This usually leads to about 15 seconds of wasted time as you stand there unable to do anything because enemies haven't appeared yet. I don't really understand why this is a thing, and worse is that those 15 seconds actually matter on some maps. There are several stages I had to redo because I was over the par time by just 5 or 6 seconds. The par time should reflect the actual amount of time you've spent dealing with the horde. The other two quality of life improvements are minor things, but they would still be nice if they could be added. The little door icon on the minimap should change to another color once you have finished off all of the enemies coming from that door for the round. Maybe this could be a green color to indicate you don't have to worry about it anymore. There were times on several of the large war scenarios where it seemed like the round was ending, but then suddenly more enemies would appear, and while it doesn't greatly impact the game, changing the door color would be a nice nonverbal cue for players. And speaking of nonverbal cues, please update the game to allow players to turn off the voice that screams, "Enemies are in the rift room."
They're almost there! They're almost there! Enemies at the rift!
It would be nice to have this option because in several maps I built my defenses in the rift room itself, and having to listen to the announcer repeat the warning over and over and over got tiresome. Now, the final thing I want to mention are two new additions that hopefully Robot Entertainment would consider for the future. These are not map design suggestions or new enemy types or trap ideas because, to be honest, I trust the developers to come up with their own design, especially given how high of quality the DLC expansions we've already gotten have been. Now, I am not a game developer, so I don't know the logistics of if these suggestions are possible, so I can only speak from a position of things that I would like to see in the game. Getting right into it, the most important of these in my opinion is to give us a DLC that incorporates all of the enemy types. The base game enemies, flyers, cyclopses, and the tuataras. I think a great challenge could be having to figure out how to handle all of these unique enemies at once. The other suggestion I want to make is to add a system that allows the use of the buffs and debuffs from the scrambled mode in the endless mode. I can't stress enough how extra engaging this could make the endless mode, as leaderboard positions could not only be based on what wave you got to, but also the buffs and debuffs you had activated. I think it could be a similar setup to what the game Hades uses with its Pact of Punishment system. Adding buffs could decrease the points earned during a run, whereas debuffs could increase it. Again, I recognize that it might not be as simple as that, but for people like me, I could see myself sinking 100 more hours into the game messing around with different debuffs. Orcs Must Die 3 is a fantastic game. For me, it sits in the throne above all other tower defense games, and I can't recommend it highly enough.